I never thought our honeymoon, something I dreamed of since the day we got engaged, would turn into the most haunting experience of my life. When Jake suggested we spend it at an off-the-map coastal resort tucked away in a tiny fishing village, I was thrilled. The pictures online showed breathtaking cliffs, a sapphire blue ocean, and a quaint old-world charm. It felt perfect, secluded enough to escape the chaos of city life, yet cozy enough for a romantic getaway. The journey to the resort was an adventure in itself. The last leg of the trip involved driving down a narrow, winding road that hugged the coastline. The waves crashed against the rocks below, and for a moment I felt a chill, not from the ocean breeze, but from how desolate the area seemed. No cars passed us, and the only sound was the rhythmic hum of our tires on the asphalt. When we finally arrived at Harbour's End Retreat, I couldn't deny how picturesque it was. The main building was a refurbished 19th century inn, with ivy crawling up its weathered stone walls and lanterns glowing softly in the dim evening light. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a strained smile, greeted us warmly. But there was something in her eyes, something uneasy. Jake didn't seem to notice, but I caught her glancing nervously over her shoulder as she handed us the key to Cottage 7, one of their private lodges perched closer to the cliffs. "Be careful near the edges," she said, her voice almost a whisper. I laughed nervously, assuming she meant the cliffs were unstable. The cottage itself was beautiful, but carried an air of neglect. The wooden floorboards creaked under our feet, and the antique furniture seemed to hold decades of untold stories. I ran my fingers along the windowsill and felt a faint layer of dust. Jake joked about it being authentic charm, but I couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. After we settled in, we decided to explore the grounds. The path leading to the cliffs was lined with gnarled trees, their branches casting eerie shadows in the fading sunlight. As we stood at the edge, looking out at the endless expanse of ocean, I noticed something strange. A single light flickering far out to sea. It wasn't a lighthouse. It moved erratically, like a lantern swaying in the wind. I mentioned it to Jake, but he shrugged it off. "Probably a fishing boat," he said. Yet, as we walked back to the cottage, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, as we unpacked, the first oddity happened. Jake opened the wardrobe to hang his jacket, only to find an old handwritten note tucked inside. It read, "They come when the tide is high. Lock the windows. Keep the lights off." I laughed nervously, assuming it was a prank left by a previous guest. Jake crumpled it up and tossed it aside, reassuring me that it was nothing. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs, I couldn't ignore the growing weight of unease settling over me. Something about this place felt wrong. I just didn't know how wrong it was. Yet. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of distant seagulls and the scent of salty ocean air. For a brief moment, the uneasiness from the previous night felt like a bad dream. Jake was already up, standing by the window, his silhouette framed by the golden morning light. "You've got to see this," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. I joined him, peering out at the cliffs. The view was breathtaking, but something caught my eye. A set of footprints in the sand, leading from the rocky shore to the base of the cliff and stopping abruptly. It struck me as odd. The tide had already come in and receded since last night, yet the prints remained perfectly intact. Probably from a hiker, Jake said casually, pulling me away from the window. Let's grab breakfast and explore the village today. The day passed pleasantly enough. The village was charming in a rugged, forgotten sort of way. The locals, however, were less welcoming. They avoided eye contact, whispering to each other as we passed. At one point, I smiled at an elderly woman selling shells by the roadside, but she just stared at me, her eyes clouded with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, when we stopped at a small cafe for lunch, I finally asked the waitress about the village's history, hoping to learn more about its mysterious aura. Her expression shifted immediately, her hands trembling as she poured our coffee. "You're staying at Harbor's End, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Yes," I said cautiously. "Is there something we should know?" She hesitated, glancing nervously at the other patrons before leaning in closer. "Don't stay out after sunset," she whispered. "And whatever you do, don't follow the lights." Before I could press her for more, the owner of the cafe barked something in a harsh tone, and she scurried away like a frightened child. Jake dismissed it as small-town superstition, but the chill in my spine lingered. That evening, back at the cottage, we decided to light a fire and enjoy some wine. The cozy atmosphere helped me relax, and for a while, I managed to forget the strange encounters. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the uneasy feeling crept back in. It started with sound. A faint tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the branches outside. But the tapping grew more deliberate, rhythmic, like someone, or something, was trying to get our attention. "Probably just a bird," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. I walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain, my heart pounding. There was nothing there, just the dark expanse of the cliffs and the faint glow of the ocean in the moonlight. But then I noticed it again. The light, the same one we'd seen the night before, bobbing up and down far out at sea. Only this time, it was closer, and it didn't move like a boat. It swayed erratically, almost as if it was searching for something, or someone. "Jake," I whispered, stepping back from the window. "That light. It's not normal." He joined me, squinting into the darkness. "It's probably just fishermen," he said, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. We tried to ignore it and went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of water dripping. At first, I thought it was the bathroom faucet, but when I turned on the bedside lamp, my blood ran cold. There was a puddle of water on the floor, directly beneath the wardrobe. It hadn't been there before. Jake groaned, half asleep, as I nudged him awake. "What now?" he mumbled, clearly irritated. "Look," I whispered, pointing to the puddle. He got up, muttering something about old pipes, and opened the wardrobe. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Inside, tucked between the hangers, was a damp, crumpled piece of paper. The ink was smudged, but I could still make out the words. "You didn't lock the windows." Jake checked the windows immediately, only to find one of them slightly ajar. "Maybe we forgot to lock it last night," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We spent the rest of the night on edge, listening to every creak and rustle, half expecting something, or someone, to break through the fragile calm. By morning, the puddle was gone, and the paper had dried out completely, as if it had never been soaked in the first place. But the memory of that night stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Something was wrong with this place, and I had a sinking feeling it was only the beginning. The next night was when everything unraveled. After the previous night's eerie incidents, I insisted we leave the cottage and head back to the main inn. Jake, ever the skeptic, brushed it off as paranoia, convincing me that the peace and privacy were worth the minor discomfort. "We'll lock the windows properly this time, and everything will be fine," he said with his usual calm reassurance. Reluctantly, I agreed, though a nagging sense of foreboding stayed with me throughout the day. We spent most of the afternoon wandering the cliffs, staying close to the marked trails. Jake took pictures while I tried to distract myself by focusing on the beauty of the scenery. But even the crashing waves and the warm sunlight couldn't shake the chill that had settled deep in my bones. By evening, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows of our cottage. I closed the curtains tightly, hoping to block out the unsettling darkness outside. Jake laughed at my nervousness, pouring us both a glass of wine. "Relax," he said, sitting on the couch. "Let's just enjoy our honeymoon." But as the night wore on, the feeling that something was watching us grew unbearable. It started again with the tapping on the window. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Jake and I froze, our eyes locking. "It's probably just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. I didn't move. I couldn't. The sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, as though someone were knocking, waiting to be let in. "Fine, I'll check," Jake said, getting up and pulling the curtain aside. He stared out into the darkness for a long moment before shaking his head. Nothing there. But I knew better. Something was out there. I could feel it. We tried to settle back down, but then the lights began to flicker. A low hum filled the room, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder, like a distant wail carried on the wind. My chest tightened as I looked at Jake, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Before he could respond, the wardrobe door creaked open. I screamed, grabbing Jake's arm, as we both stared at the empty space inside. Only, it wasn't empty. Hanging from the rack was a soaking wet coat that hadn't been there before. Water dripped from its hem, pulling onto the floor in the exact spot we'd found the puddle the night before. Jake stepped forward cautiously, reaching out to touch the coat. The moment his fingers brushed the fabric, a loud knock reverberated through the room, this time from the front door. We both jumped, Jake cursing under his breath. Who the hell could that be at this hour? He moved toward the door, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking. "It's not safe." But Jake was already unlocking the door, determined to prove there was nothing to fear. As he pulled it open, a gust of icy wind blew in, extinguishing the fire in the hearth. The doorway was empty, but just beyond the porch, illuminated by the pale moonlight, stood a figure. It was hard to make out its features, but it looked wrong. Its posture hunched, its limbs unnaturally long. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at us, and I swear I saw its lips move, though no sound came out. Jake slammed the door shut, bolting it before turning to me. "What the hell was that?" "I told you we should have left," I hissed, my voice trembling with fear. The knocking started again, this time coming from all around us. The windows, the walls, even the roof. It was deafening, relentless. And then, over the noise, we heard it. A voice, faint but clear, whispering our names. "Jake! Claire!" It came from everywhere, and nowhere all at once. I clung to Jake, my heart pounding, as the lights flickered violently. The temperature in the room dropped, our breath visible in the frigid air. Suddenly, the wardrobe door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire cottage. The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even worse. "We're leaving," Jake said, grabbing my hand. We didn't bother packing. Jake flung the door open, and we ran out into the night, the cold air biting at our skin. The moonlight guided our path back toward the main inn. But as we neared the cliffs, we saw them. Lights, dozens of them, bobbing in the darkness like lanterns. They floated toward us, moving in unison, cutting off our path, and then we saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their faces blank, their bodies dripping with water. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking with each step, their heads tilting at impossible angles. We turned and ran the other way, our lungs burning as we sprinted up the hill toward the village. Behind us, the lights and figures followed, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Don't look back," Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of my own panicked breathing. But I did. I couldn't help it. And what I saw will haunt me forever. One of the figures was closer than the others, its face inches from mine. Its eyes were empty sockets, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. I stumbled, falling to the ground as Jake pulled me to my feet. When we finally reached the village, the figures stopped, retreating into the shadows as though they couldn't cross some invisible boundary. We banged on the inn's door until the receptionist let us in, her face pale. "You saw them, didn't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. We didn't answer. We didn't need to. The morning after our horrifying escape from the cottage, Jake and I sat in the dimly lit dining room of the village inn. We hadn't slept. My hands shook as I clutched a steaming cup of tea, and Jake stared blankly at the wooden table, his face pale and drawn. The receptionist, the same woman who had let us in during the night, approached cautiously. Her demeanor had shifted. She was no longer simply polite, but genuinely concerned. "You need to leave," she said firmly, her voice a low whisper. Jake looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot. "What are those things?" he demanded. "What's happening in this place?" The woman hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. Finally, she sat down across from us and spoke in hushed tones. "They are the lost ones," she said, "souls of the drowned who never found peace. For centuries, they've haunted Harbor's End. Anyone who stays too long risks becoming one of them." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why didn't you warn us earlier?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We try," she replied, her expression pained, "but most visitors don't listen. They dismiss our warnings as superstition until it's too late." Jake shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "But we're leaving today, right? They can't follow us once we're gone?" The woman hesitated again, her silence answering the question. "You may have crossed the line," she said finally. "Once they've marked you, they don't let go easily." Her words hung heavy in the air. Jake stood abruptly, pacing the room. "This is ridiculous. We'll leave now, drive straight out of this cursed place, and never look back." But even as he spoke, I felt the weight of the truth settle in my chest. Something had changed in us, in me. I could feel it, like a shadow that wouldn't lift. We packed our bags and left the inn, the villagers watching us in somber silence as we drove away. The road out of Harbor's End was narrow and winding, bordered by dense forests and the occasional glimpse of the sea. For a moment, I dared to hope we'd escape unscathed. But then I saw it, a light in the distance, floating between the trees. "Don't stop," I whispered, clutching Jake's arm. "I'm not," he replied, his grip tightening on the wheel. The light grew brighter, closer, until it was right in front of us, blocking the road. Jake slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop. For a moment, everything was silent. And then they appeared. The figures emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted in anguish, their hands reaching out toward the car. Jake threw the car into reverse, but the figures surrounded us, their whispers filling the air. "We can't outrun them," I said, tears streaming down my face. "What do they want?" Jake didn't answer. He just held my hand tightly as the figures pressed against the windows, their hollow eyes staring into ours. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. The road was clear, the forest silent once more. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Epilogue. It's been 6 months since that night, and life hasn't returned to normal. Jake and I moved back to the city, but I still see them. In reflections, in the corner of my eye, in my dreams. Jake pretends everything is fine, but I catch him staring out the window at night, his expression haunted. I've started to wonder if we ever really left Harbor's End, or if a part of us is still trapped there, waiting for the lights to return.